Hello and welcome to the 76th episode of a NEOHUMAN podcast. I'm Agah Bahari, a Dogologist on Twitter and Instagram, and you can follow this show on liveinlimbo.com, iTunes, YouTube, BitChute, and soon on Spotify. And today with me, I have the pleasure of having James Lindsay. Welcome to NEOHUMAN podcast, James.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Let's start with your background, the work you've done, the lives you've lived, and what are you mainly focused on now these days?
Oh, God. So my background, I guess it's relevant to mention that I have a doctorate in mathematics, but I don't do mathematics, and I've not done mathematics professionally in 10 years. So that kind of places me educationally, but it may be sort of professionally. So what happened from finishing my doctorate and then leaving academia, I started to get into kind of this independent vein of research around religion and ultimately mostly psychology related to religion. That developed for a number of years. I was involved in what would have been called the New Atheist movement, and I kind of watched that get eaten from the inside by social justice, if you will. And my attentions turned to that as that was, unfolding in front of me. I would say that if I had a consistent theme in life that's kind of driven me is that I can't stand stupidness and unfairness. And so that was exhibiting both. So I felt like I had to say something about it and understand it and try to do something with it. Then I became something of a figure by my participation in what has come to be known as the Grievance Studies Affair. So I don't know if your listeners know what that is, but in 2017 and 18, I, with two colleagues who are named Peter Boghossian and Helen Pluckrose, wrote a series of quality assurance testing, bogus academic papers that targeted fields like gender studies, which we summarized under the heading Grievance Studies. And we wrote about we actually wrote 20 of them, and we submitted them to the highest standing academic journals that were within scope of what we were arguing. And 7 of those were accepted for publication. 4 of them were actually published. One of them won an award for excellence. 7 more were still under peer review, some of them with great, rather favorable reviews. When the Wall Street Journal published an expose of what we were doing, having been caught out in the middle of it and not getting to wrap it up. And so since then, I've been studying this material really deeply. I've written a book with Peter Boghossian about how to have impossible conversations. That's the title of it, to figure out how to talk to people with whom we don't agree. And then I have written a book with the other of my colleagues, Helen Pluckrose, diving more deeply into the academic theory that has put the legs underneath social justice scholarship. It's not exactly a book that explains how we did the fake papers project, but it does explain the theory in which we were using it, or an aspect of the theory. In particular, it traces its postmodern roots. So that book's called Cynical Theories, and it comes out in August or after the pandemic, kind of more vaguely, depending on what happens with the book industry. And so I also started a website called New Discourses, and it's kind of a platform for educational resources. My goal is to help people understand kind of the crazy currents in society. So I've studied, for example, social justice theory rather deeply now. I can understand it. I can actually think kind of, it's like, when people learn other languages, they say that there's this point you cross where you can dream in another language. I can do that with the social justice mentality. And so I'm trying to explain it and other related phenomena, and I'm open to explaining other things that are kind of failures of communication and sense making on the platform. So that's what I've been up to. That's who I am.
I had Peter on the podcast, Peter Boghossian, for the book, How to Have Impossible Conversations. And I found it interesting that the summary of our conversation was that, well, you must be willing to have a conversation at first in order to learn how to have impossible conversations. And it seems like such an impossible task to talk to these social justice people because they're coming from the place of faith rather than reason and conversation. Have you felt it the same way?
Yeah, I mean, there's actually multiple levels upon which that's a problem. One of those is that you're right. They're coming from something that's much more a position of faith than it is from reason. Secondly, the amount of, I mean, they've kind of, on one level, they've kind of given up on having conversation because they occupy a completely different understanding of everything in the world. It's very difficult to communicate that, and I sound crazy, but when I say it, but it's true. They have a completely different theory of what a person is. It started with the personal is the political, and it's now arrived at a person is their politics. So if you don't understand that, you're just going to talk past them. They have their own theory of mind, theory of agency, theory of knowledge, theory of ethics. They're kind of an entire. I said to somebody the other day, in fact, that to call it a religion misses the full scope of how radically different a way of thinking.
A fundamentalist religion maybe would be a better kind of a description, right?
It's a fundamentalist religion indeed, yes, and I can defend that, rooted in the literature about what a fundamentalist religion is, but it's also it's an entire culture that it's like you talk about the subculture or whatever. It's no longer a subculture, but it is a completely different culture that understands the world in a completely different way on almost every conceivable level. And the third reason, so that they've shied away from conversation is a second reason here, because all the conversations are just people talking past each other. And they tell you over and over again that they're exhausted. I don't want to have this conversation. It's not my job to educate you, blah, 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 blah. They've had it. They tried it for a couple of years and it didn't work and they gave up. So they're just going to browbeat people now because it's a moral conversation, which places it in the world of faith in a sense. And then the third reason is that they actually, because they have this weird view about power structures and the weird view about how language is relevant to power structures and association is relevant to power structures, they have this really weird view that dialogue, in fact, is dangerous. The dialogue itself is part of the problem. So they have concepts like, just to talk about dialogue being dangerous, that has pretty deep roots. But they even have concepts like what's called non-consensual co platforming, which means that, for example, if some social justice person published an article in, say, New York Times Opinion, and then later I published an article critical of social justice things in New York Times Opinion, because it's the same venue, the New York Times Opinion editors have now non-consensually, because they didn't ask the social justice person's permission to publish me, they have non-consensually co-platformed us, put us in the same outlet, and therefore they become guilty and complicit in the problem or whatever that the social justice
facilitating this rape.
Yeah, it's pretty much like that. And so they are actually not just exhausted of conversation, they're actually hostile to the idea of conversation because they believe that it perpetuates the problematic discourses. It perpetuates the power structures in society to even have dialogue. What their agenda is to, they have a different worldview, and it is to utterly destroy the previous worldview, the one that most of us still operate within.
So this alternate universe that they've created, this must have been built upon a bunch of texts and bunch of opinions and bunch of worldviews and perspective coming mainly, which is what I learned from Peter, mainly from academia, right? So what has happened there? How all of this could have evolved in a way, this unreasonable course of action could have evolved within academia that's supposed to be a free platform for discourse and debates and conversation, to the point that, as you're saying, it's not a subculture anymore. It's an alternative culture that can very well threaten the rest of us who, they're not even willing to talk to us.
Do you want the short answer?
I think it's really important to understand, where does this come from? That
feminism.
It all came from feminism.
I can almost, not quite all from feminism, but and this is a very long and complicated story depending on how we want to tell it. But how did it actually make its way into academia was primarily during the 1960s, but also going into the 1970s, was this transition that was beginning in mostly English literature departments, where you started to have, mostly women doing feminism, and occasionally you'd have, of course, up until the 1960s, you would not have had, say, black professors or other in America racial minority professors being hired. But the university started to correct for this. They started to desegregate and integrate and so on, and they started bringing in faculty members of other races. And so some of these, again, mostly in English literature departments, started to do things like women's studies, feminist studies, ethnic studies, African American studies. And some of that's like, obviously legit. If you want to look into that, you want to, like, say you're a literature professor and you want to focus on African American literature or something like that, there's every reason to think that that's an interesting project. But because, in particular with feminism, though it was in various degrees in all of this, the goal in feminism was very blatantly very activist from the beginning. And they didn't have the, a robust corpus of academic literature. So they kind of had to manufacture one on the spot. And they started to build one. And more or less, the rest of the academy sort of turned a blind eye. So what actually happened was that universities started to allow these feminist literature professors to have feminist departments like women's studies, which went on to become gender studies. Occasionally, but very rarely, feminist studies. It's much more commonly women's studies. And so they started creating these alternative departments and staffing them with what turned out to be activists. And this, of course, blossomed heavily during the New Left rise in the late 60s and early 1970s. And there you start getting into those deeper currents of, philosophy and history. The New Left mostly was philosophically informed by the Frankfurt School, which is in a sense it's a critical theory think tank that is, neo-Marxism is actually what it's called, or sometimes cultural Marxism is what their project was called. And it tried to move the views of Marx out of the ideas of economics and into the ideas of culture. And so there are these deep currents, but these feminist departments started to manufacture very agendist literature, and a blind eye was turned to them for a very long time. Nobody wanted to criticize them. Nobody knew what was going on. Nobody wanted to get called a sexist for going after it, and they just kind of let them do what they want to do. And this corpus of literature started to build and build and build on itself, and it started to take on various other elements of critical theories. It took on postmodern theory in the 1980s, or a garbled version thereof, or something like that. And then it's just continued to grow, where it's had the policy of saying that any criticism of it is illegitimate because it must be attacking the people, the women or the minorities, rather than the scholarship itself. And it's been very, very effective at manipulating scholars in particular into not properly criticizing it, because it'll call them sexist or racist or accuse them of complicity in some system of power. And so theory built upon theory, built upon theory, built upon theory for a number of decades, actually, to the point where finally, and I do say finally in a sense of, there being a real turning point. This started, like I said, in the 1960s. It wasn't really until 2010 that this got, a proper, grip around the throat of society and stopped being some weird little academic subculture. But the short answer to your question is academic feminism is how it happened. And just to make one real quick point about that, one of the most interesting, weird things they did, being literature professors, is they took up the tools of literary criticism, which in particular for activists like feminist literary critics, it's a tool called close reading, or discourse analysis. They're two different tools. And close reading is, you might read a text, its theme doesn't matter. You're only looking for the places where it supports, maybe patriarchal ideas or thought or narratives or something like that. And then the whole text can be impugned based upon on finding those things, often which are not there, but are read into the text by the feminist at hand. And so because they took up this habit of studying women's issues and culture via tools like literary criticism uses, like they're reading it like society. They started to read literally like a book. and to look for all of its little problematic features, which it assumed must be baked in because the power systems are there and so on. And so because it had this really bizarre approach, they also were able to insulate themselves from criticism, because sociologists, for example, if they wanted to challenge this stuff, wouldn't be able to, because it's using techniques of literary criticism, which they have no expertise in and have no idea about, because why in the world would they? It's not a sociological technique, it's literary criticism. So that, they could play these kind of games with this like out of scope theory building, and they've built an entire alternate universe in the process. I don't want to let sociology totally off the hook either. Sociology mostly, it technically began with people like Emile Durkheim, but it was taken up very heavily by the critical theorists very intentionally. Most of early sociology developed under the auspices of entities, think tank type entities like the critical theorist Frankfurt School, and like the socialist think tank, the Fabian Society, which went on to spawn the London School of Economics, for example, in the UK. So, I mean, a lot of sociology was always done in a very agendist way. So it also has some issues there. And you can talk about it in other fields as well. Cultural anthropology had problems from very early on, and so on.
It just sounds like a very systematic and well thought of kind of a process that, as you said, it took a couple of decades, but the turning point that you mentioned, 2010, is very aligned and completely makes sense with the growth of social media and alternative media. Basically, the kind of alliances that have been created between the neo-Marxists and this new left, far left, whatever you want to call them, with big tech and mainstream media, was that a turning point for that alliance as well? And was that the reason that they basically became such a real threat, I would say, to who disagreed with them?
So I think there are two things actually happening, and they are related to one another here, or maybe three things. We'll see how they pan out. Certainly, the new media environment, which doesn't just everybody thinks, oh, it's the internet. It actually extends backwards to when even mass broadcasting became more democratized. When it used to be the case that there was like a really strong media monopoly held by, CBS, NBC, the very small number of companies, or if you were outside of the United States, possibly state-run operations. So there's kind of a media monopoly going on there. And then that started to break as technology allowed more people to start doing talk radio. This has been in the 1980s. And then eventually cable television and a proliferation of cable television stations. So now you weren't locked into just a few channels. Now you had, I remember the old Bruce Springsteen song, 57 channels and nothing's on. It was 57 at the time, then it was 400. Now there's like literally thousands of them, I think. And then the internet came along and just exploded this to the next level. And then handheld devices came along and it's with you everywhere and exploded it to another level. And so these features, blogs in particular, were very influential early on at being able to connect people who had similar ideas. And they sort of enable this whole appeal to these grievances or victimhood or trauma or harm, and whip up a mob of people who are going to agitate in support of that. So it very much does require this kind of new media environment for it to exist. And I think that genie's out of the bottle. I don't think we're going back, and I don't think we would want to go back to gated media communities, but definitely it was in that situation that this was possible. So one feature of that in terms of activism were, like I said, blogs, and famously Tumblr, if you want to talk about where most of queer and gender theory exploded in the past 20 years or 15 years, I guess, would have been through the platform Tumblr, which is considers itself a social media blogging platform. But other blogs were happening and people were writing and developing these theories that in a way that was never possible before, because it had to happen through academic publishing or even regular publishing, which requires a lot of infrastructure. It's slow, it's heavy. To get something published in academia takes months and months and months and months, but a blog publishes as fast as you push click on the mouse. You submit or update or whatever it happens to be, post, whatever the label is on the button, and then it's everywhere. It's literally got a global distribution audience if people know about your blog. So, that was a massive change that caused a lot of this. Meanwhile, in the academy itself, while these developments were happening, in technology, the academy was building up on layer upon layer upon layer of generations of theory. So when these first feminists were writing this stuff, and was it the feminine mystique? Was that right? No, the second sex. Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex was in 1949. So starting then and kind of moving forward, it was very like avant-garde, and it was, well, the theorist says this, and according to this theory that, and according to that theory, and it's very kind of the lens of theory was made very clear. And then by 2010 it just started to be accepted that this is just, we know this stuff now, we know about these systems of power, these are realities of the world, and people started talking that way. The phrase is known knowns. It's actually hard to say that verbally and have people hear it. It's easy to write. So it's things that people just know are known. And so within the academy, there was this academic literature. There's this big shift in the late 2000 aughts into the early 2010s, in which they're no longer appealing to the theoretical construct. They're just stating it like fact. And there's no longer this reliance on this really deep, complicated jargon for the most part. They start stating it in very simple terms. In fact, a lot of their literature in the last 10 years reads like they're talking down to a 10-year-old. And a 10-year-old could probably read a lot of it. So there's been this massive change in the academy because, in their view, their theory has matured to the point where it's just true. And so that changed their perspective rather considerably. So those kind of things, the technological advances made it possible for it to take root in the world. And then I hate to call it the maturity of theory, because it's a very immature theory in another sense. But the fact that their theory has had many decades of building on itself just made it able to just be taken as, in a sense, gospel.
How can a theory become mature when it's contained by morality, though? That's the thing. I keep bringing up what AOC said, that it's more important to be moral than being factual, or morally right than factually correct. It says everything that people need to know about this whole thing, that morality that comes from lack of factuality.
Right. That's why I hesitate around the word mature. It matured in the sense of its own kind of ecosystem. It is not a mature theory of the world. It does not have a good understanding of things. It is, in a sense, so in 2014, I believe, the astrophysicist Sean Carroll, who incidentally is very taken in by this social theory, which is kind of funny, had a debate with the famous evangelical Christian apologist, William Lane Craig. And he did that in Louisiana, I think in New Orleans, in February, I think, of 2014. And it was a stunning spectacle to watch. I think it was actually a turning point, in a sense, for designing arguments about kind of moral ideologies. And what Sean Carroll did was stood up there, and if you know about William Lane Craig, he's a very detailed debater. He's a very educated man. He's a very intelligent man. He's a very sharp debater, and he does do his homework. So he knows the other side fairly well. He knows where the holes are to pick at, and he can do it really, really well. And normally he goes in these debates and he convinces a lot of people, and it's kind of back and forth about the details, and everything gets all murky. And Sean Carroll didn't take that approach. Sean Carroll stood up there and said, yeah, you're putting forth, you're talking about this model, and then there's this other model in cosmology, and then there's this other model. There's lots of models. There are a lot of models. And this thing you're doing with theology is another model. But we actually have ways to tell how mature a model is, how good of a model of the world it is. It has to meet certain criteria. And he starts listing the criteria for a model to be grown up. And it's, it can do this, it can do that. It has these properties. And he starts laying them out. And he's like, most of the property, it's like, I don't know which theory of cosmology is correct, and neither do you. But these that we're talking about that fall within cosmology are mature models because they meet all of these criteria, whereas the theology model doesn't meet any of the criteria, except maybe the first one or something like that. And so this is the same thing that's happening here. When you see somebody like AOC saying it's more important to be morally correct than factually correct, or morally right than factually correct, or however the exact phrasing goes, that's actually the same thing. It's this appealing back to these immature models that suit our intuitions, our moral feelings about things, rather than trying to actually understand the world. And that is actually a catastrophe when you live in an advanced democracy, in an advanced world. When you live in a world that has the kind of technological power that we have in the kind of complex systems, even for like food distribution, you cannot go away from factually correct and expect that things to go okay. It's it is actually catastrophic. So it is very alarming. And so when I say it matured, I mean it's like I don't know a good there are no good metaphors to use for it, but it's like it doesn't have the it's not a mature model, but within its own ecosystem, it is now seen as a mature model, is maybe the best way to put it. It's seen as something that's got a long academic pedigree. And then people outside of the model, say like Sean Carroll in this case, look upon this and they're like, oh, well, they've been doing whatever they're doing. I don't know the details, but they've been doing it for, it's important for at least 50 years. So, it's pretty well established at this point. And then they have that sense of pretty well established, even though what's inside is utter crap. It's a moral agenda that's rooted in a very particular political view rather than anything like truth or knowledge or accuracy or civility or any of the norms of liberal society, for example.
And what's interesting to me is that based on what you said, it became what it became because of democratization of information that has worked like a double-edged sword. That now they want to contain it in favor of themselves, pushing YouTube, for example, removing channels that are talking against what they believe, or Twitter, the same thing, which begs the question, is democracy itself a platform that allow these people to take over based on, because one vote is equal to another vote, and a far left vote can neutralize a vote of a rational thinker. Have we reached the limits of representative democracy? Because people who believe in whatever they want to believe in, and there's nothing we can do about it because they believe in it.
See, that's an interesting question because, I mean, even the ancient Greeks knew that democracy had its limits.
Yes.
And they were very afraid of democracy. And so when the Enlightenment liberalism phase in the mostly 18th century arose, and we started establishing these things, we didn't establish democracies. We established Republican democracies. So the idea was actually that there was supposed to be a layer of experts between legislation and the people, because the people directly will never protect the minority interest. There are all kinds of problems with either mob rule or majority rule or so on and so forth. And so the idea was that you would have a competent professional class who the public then decide upon, and then the competent professional class are going to be the ones who actually do the legislating and the governance. And of course, it's never worked out perfectly because people are people. And there have been lots of problems with it. There have been a few things that have been going on over the past, centuries, or a century in particular, which has been this great push for more and more and more and more democracy. Like democracy is this unfettered good without a balancing more and more and more republicanism, which means that there is not necessarily a technocratic expert class in between, but that there is a professional class of people who actually, when put up as representatives, know what they're doing. So now it's like, because again, probably of the way that things have changed, it's very easy to just become famous and then get elected based on your fame. We now have a problem, and there's this big bias toward, we've got to get these professionals out of here. We need everyday citizens in Congress, and actually we probably don't, not very often anyway. And so now there's this odd problem where we still have a Republican representative democracy, but we're electing morons. We're electing agenda-driven fools. Luckily, there's still enough of a balance of power to keep that from doing anything, but the answer that it's arrived us at is utter stalemate. And since there's utter political stalemate, the result is that everything switches down to the next level, which is to start trying to enforce power through culture. Now, as for them trying to take away the keys to free speech, which is a separate issue, it's really interesting because you can think of this actually reveals that these people are tin pot dictators. because what's happening is the dictator's dilemma, as it sometimes gets called. The dictator's dilemma is an information rule. So with the dictator's dilemma, if you're a dictator, you have to figure out how to handle information flow. You know that your regime is doing things you don't want the public to find out about, because then they'll depose you. So you've got this problem, and you have to decide, well, do I allow information to flow, or do I shut it off? And the dictator is in a dilemma once you get to a sufficient amount of information flow, not just a couple of state channels, like you say have in North Korea. Because once there's information flow, if they allow it, it will be their undoing, because their corruption and so on and brutality will be unmasked. That's what you saw happen with the Arab Spring, for example. Arising was the brutality, like the Mubarak, what was it? Hosni Mubarak in Egypt. The brutality of that regime was exposed, and all of a sudden everything erupted in Cairo in 2011. And so the other side of the coin is they can repress information, but then people know that the information is being repressed, so you out yourself as a dictator. And people don't much like feeling like they're being lied to and having information restricted from them. And so when you see this with the social justice crowd now, with these kind of big tech companies, you're having the same thing play out. Actually, the exact same dynamic is playing out. It's very clearly the same thing, because you have this kind of people, this group of people all over social media. I don't want to say it's a hard group, but you have a lot of people acting on social media who are very aware that there are YouTube censors, that there are Twitter censors, that there are Facebook censors, and that these people are enacting their social vision on the public. So they're picking the repressed side of the dictator's dilemma. But once you choose either course of that, you then reveal yourself to be a dictator. So these people trying to, now that they have hegemonic control over a lot of culture, are trying to enact a dictatorial program. And the reasons are obvious, besides the fact that they're explicitly anti-liberal and have blamed liberal society for every problem in the world going back to the 1920s. They are, if you didn't know that, they do. One of the core pillars of what's called critical race theory is anti-liberalism. It's like the third pillar when they list them in order. It's sort of important to be anti-liberal.
What's the first two?
What's that?
What are the first two?
The first one is that racism is ordinary in American society. And the second one is interest convergence, which is that members of, since it's race, we'll say just white people, but it's generally dominant groups, don't give opportunities to minority groups or oppressed groups unless it's also in their interest to do so. So there's always a selfish motive if things get better for any minority group. So those are the first two, and the third one is anti-liberalism.
Do you think someone like Joe Biden is kind of helping these people or hurting them by saying stuff like, if you don't vote for me, you ain't black? Like, what does that
say? He's hurting. It's such a complicated way to talk helping and hurting, because it's like, who? He's not helping his cause to get elected. That's for certain. But he is signaling to the in crowd, for the most part, that he's kind of hip to the social justice jive, if you will. So, but even within that one fell. The bad part is that Biden was probably just making a joke that landed really badly, whereas other people really do make that argument.
It's not only Biden. The guy in Virginia wore blackface or KKK hood, and whatever. Trudeau in Canada, he says clearly, I don't even remember how many times I wore blackface. He groped a 18-year-old reporter in Montreal and I didn't do it. But, just imagine if Trump would be doing any of that. So this hypocrisy, I'm just wondering until what point the mainstream would be there's no way that we can cover for these people.
The far left will cover for these people literally forever, because your politics are your person. And so literally forever. So you just going to have to deal with that. But the deal is what you just pointed at. The hypocrisy is obvious and everybody else hates it. I don't know why human beings are as sensitive to hypocrisy as we are. I know why we're sensitive to it. I mean, the reasons are easy to work out why we would be sensitive to hypocrisy. But because you got people who would be, double dealing and telling people what to do and working their own advantage. So it makes sense why we're sensitive to it. But we are like psychologically hypersensitive to the level where I'm almost convinced that we would gladly watch the world be destroyed around us and do nothing, as long as we could call everybody out as hypocrites, who's being a hypocrite. Yeah. It's like it blinds us to every other concern. So like when this happens with Biden, or when Ta-Nehisi Coates says that Kanye West is no longer black because he wore a MAGA hat, and these different examples that you've brought up, with more stuff with Biden, stuff around Trudeau. I mean, it's really everywhere. The Virginia guy. When you bring these things up, everybody else is like, screw these people, they're hypocrites, right? What they're detecting is in the literature called parochial altruism. They're showing that these people are just playing for their team. They're not honest brokers, and then that turns people away from them. So I mean, Biden hurt his electoral chances, which hurts the progressive agenda rather a lot when he said that. But as it works out, depending on who you're asking, some of them very much were glad he said it and defended it and all of these things, because it signals the right kind of politics. So it's like, I don't know, I'm old enough to remember, and it's happening now on the left, but it was definitely more happening on the right 10, 15 years ago. But the saying was that conservatism doesn't fail. People fail conservatism. And it's like the same thing's happening on the left now. It's like social justice can't fail. Mm-hmm. People fail social justice. And when you have that, you have this situation where literally you're doing something that hurts your own interests, driving your movement more into the crazy. And nevertheless, people within it think it's the right thing to have done, and believe that it helps their interests because they're more concerned about the depth of moral purity in their fundamentally religious at that point movement than they are about actually succeeding at anything. And this is, I mean, it's got to be said at some point very clearly, progressive social justice stuff isn't actually progressive at all. It has people call it the regressive left for a reason. Mm-hmm. It has no real interest in progress. It's not about progress. It's about empowering the people that have the ability to push this stuff. It's not about progress in any respect whatsoever.
You mentioned the new atheist movement was also hijacked by the social justice and feminism. Would you expand on that? Because I also asked this question from Peter Boghossian, that he was also very instrumental, obviously, in the new atheist movement, that one of the argument is that the reason that we are here was because we have moved away from the values that have been created in the West, and especially the United States, because of Judeo-Christian approach and ethics and morality that had allowed liberalism, classic liberalism, to grow to where it was. But new atheism basically came and said, none of that matters, but it created its own tribe and tribal attitude of and approach of itself.
I think that is in very, very like impressionistic pictures kind of accurate, but it gives the new atheist movement more credit than it deserves. Mm. I think it is generally right that the decline of what you might call traditional Judeo-Christian values, I kind of recoil at that term, but we'll go with it, did create and make the space for this. But again, the new atheist thing started in 2004. And you can date it to the publication of The End of Faith by Sam Harris. It's widely agreed to be the beginning of the so-called new atheist movement. And the deep criticism of liberalism and of religion and its role in maintaining inequalities in society dates back to the 1920s with the Frankfurt School for certain, among other kind of parallel movements. Certainly Marxism had these kinds of things in it, and Nietzsche talked about these kinds of things. I think once Darwin wrote down the theory of evolution, and even in some sense, once Newton wrote down the laws of motion, the ability to believe in a properly pre-modern world that's guided by the hand of deities was going to just start dissolving. And so we've had a slow dissolution. Now, the atheist movement itself, the new atheist movement, the 2004 to, I think it died out by 2015. It believes it's still in existence, but I think it was dead by 2015. So we'll give it that 11-year run. That came along and was very much so a blend of a kind of Enlightenment rationalist thing and a very much social justice, pissed off at religion for the way that it has treated women and gay people in particular. And so you had this very strong kind of gender and feminism driven social justice movement that was in it. And it really did allow it did help, I should say, the incubation of that movement in American society and other English speaking societies in the world, because it gave it a home and it gave it a lot of ability, and it started to further crack those structures that were keeping it at bay. But I think we would still be pretty close if the new atheism had never happened. I think we'd still be pretty close to where we are now just because of the internet. Feminism was still happening. It just would have caught on somewhere else. It caught on in atheism first, really, in a very significant way for, I think, very significant reasons, which I said many of the people involved in the new atheist movement were there because they were pissed off about the way that Christianity in the United States in particular was treating women and homosexuals. And so it was a social justice rooted movement that took up a lot of these critical theories off of all the blogs they were reading and sharing at the time. And so by 2008 and 9, it had got really hot. By 2011, there was a incident that became kind of the triggering incident where the community split around it. And it was a death spiral from there. That was the so-called elevator gate incident, which I don't know if you are familiar with what happened. Peter probably described it, but maybe not.
Please expand on that. Yeah, I don't think I know about that.
Okay, so what was going on up to that point was there was this is what happens in general. So it's worth paying attention. If you have an organization and it's tipping, like, oh, well, let's do some diversity stuff. Let's let that in. This is what happens in general. And the atheist movement went through this in, like I said, the lead up would have been 2007, 8, 9, 10. And what happens is people increasingly start pushing for the activist agenda, the social justice agenda. In this case, like I said, it was mostly feminism. They were very concerned about sexism in the atheist movement. They started saying that the atheist movement itself was systemically sexist. There's an old boys club, blah, blah, blah. It tried to keep women down. A lot of these people were people who were, very just motivated by the activism. Other ones were very clearly careerist because they were trying to leverage that to get speaking arrangements and conferences and, book deals and things like that. And many of them succeeded in doing so. So that by 2011, your typical atheist conference would have lots of panels by kind of these little activists who mostly their only claim to fame was having a blog. When I got involved in the atheism movement, my whole first thing was having a blog because it was all bloggers. And so you could actually become somebody with a salary of a sense in the movement by having an influential enough blog. And this kind of social complaining can give you a lot of influence. So as it pans out, there's this big conference that happens in 2011, and one of these activists has her panel that she's on, and she delivers her talk in her panel. Her name's Rebecca Watson. She goes after the panel later in the day. She gets in the elevator to go up in the hotel to her room. Some man gets it. I don't know. I think young, but I don't know for sure the details of the man gets in the elevator at the same time, just by coincidence. As the elevator's going up, he plucks up the courage, asks her out to coffee. Says, I really liked your panel. Would like to know if I could take you to coffee sometime or something like this. And the elevator stops at her floor. She says no, everything, that's it, the end. He doesn't chase her. He doesn't come into her room. He doesn't keep the elevator closed and try to kiss her or some crazy, nothing happens. She said no, he gets shut down. He's like, okay. She gets off the elevator at her floor, goes to her room, immediately turns on her computer, flips on her webcam, and does a video blog about how this is completely inappropriate. This is sexism in the atheist movement. This is why the whole thing's sexist. It makes women like her very uncomfortable. She's a speaker, and then some guy is just going to talk to her in the elevator. She doesn't know if he's going to rape her. She's terrified, blah, blah, blah. The whole kind of overblown, typical reaction that we're all familiar with this kind of shit now. And so this goes kind of viral in the atheist community, and maybe it would have died a moderately quiet death, and the big death knell incident would have waited till later. But then one Richard Dawkins decided to make fun of it publicly, and I understand why. And so he writes this letter called the Dear Muslima letter, talking about how women are treated under the more brutal interpretations of Islam. And he's like, but don't worry, Rebecca Watson got asked out in an elevator or something, like, some just perspective blasting, snarky thing. And so this, of course, went absolutely viral because Richard Dawkins wrote it, and it was just a huge deal around that. And so what happens is, generally, to kind of like take one step back real quick, you're going to let some diversity in. That's a good idea. You start building up, the pattern is you start building up a set of sympathies to that worldview, and you start to build up a set of people. Once it hits 15 to 20% of your community, probably even 7 to 8%, you're in a lot of trouble. And then a precipitating event, in this case, it was Richard Dawkins responding to that video, comes along, and it forces now everybody to start taking sides. And so, in a sense, in 2011, starting with what was now called Elevator Gate, the Me Too movement actually started in the atheist movement, but nowhere else. And it went wildfire. It was to the point where people were scared to go to atheist conferences at all, lest they get accused of like hooking up with somebody. Even if they didn't do it, maybe they're just going to get accused. Like, men were afraid to go to conferences. They started leveraging this to, get Richard Dawkins isn't allowed to speak at conferences anymore. Well, guess what? People go to conferences to see headliners. They don't go to see some dork with a blog who's bitching about feminism. And so the whole like architecture of conferences and book deals and all of these things started to change really rapidly. And the whole community polarized around it. So you had to pick a side, and your side was either going to be that you were going to be a feminist, or you were going to be on the side of this patriarchal sexism that characterizes the true nature of the atheist movement, which has now been revealed because its biggest leaders have said things like what Richard Dawkins did, or Sam Harris got caught out. And he didn't get caught out. He got asked some question in a gotcha style, answered with a odd joke that was probably ill-advised, and then it somehow magically proved his sexism. So now all of the great architects, I mean, Christopher Hitchens had famously written a piece called Women Aren't Funny.
Yes.
And so like all of them basically got nuked for being sexist. The whole program is sexist. So now we've got to undo systemic sexism. And then there's this rape culture throughout because some guy asked a woman out in an elevator. So now there's obviously rape culture, and all these guys will hook up, and there were all these powerful, I mean, it's what famous people tend to do, is that, famous men tend to have women become very interested in them. Some of them just want to have sex with the person because they're famous, or maybe because they like them, or they're interested, or whatever the reasons are. But some of them see, man, maybe if so-and-so has sex with me, then he's going to help my career.
Right.
And then a lot of times the man doesn't see it that way. It doesn't help her career. And all of a sudden she changed her mind and she was raped or sexually assaulted. And his power she was the only one paying attention to it. His power is the reason that he was able to coerce her into having sex, even though maybe it was her idea in the first place. And this stuff happens all the time. And so now it became like, you couldn't go to conferences. They weren't fun. There was nothing interesting was going on. There were constant squabbles, people getting thrown out, deplatformed, canceled, and so on. It was just, and everybody's afraid they're going to get accused. So the whole thing melted down and fell apart from within over this. By, like I said, 4 years later, the thing was a, burned out husk of what it used to be. And so, again, I think it gives too much credit to say that the new atheism movement came in and like made this happen. I think that tracks back a lot longer. The Enlightenment, this is the consequence of the Enlightenment in some respect. But the new atheist movement, the decline of religion, and thus open space for things like this is the consequence of the Enlightenment, not this specific thing, because this is definitely anti-Enlightenment. But then the New Atheist movement itself provided a very nurturing spot to incubate one corner of that movement, that then those people, no longer having a movement, but having lots of activity left in them, lots of activism left in them, had to go out and start colonizing other places and ruining those places too. And that's, I think, kind of, a more comprehensive picture of how that went down. But it's a model. It's a model for how this will play out in everything that takes this stuff on.
And first of all, it's fascinating to me that the entire New Atheist movement was derailed because of an elevator and a feminist. And the whole microcosm of what happened and how much we can learn from it, and people completely ignore what happened. But the atheism, I didn't know it was called New Atheism back then. When I came from Iran as a refugee to Canada, it was very attractive to me. I would call myself a militant atheist. I listened, I got all of DVDs by the Four Horsemen, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, Richard Dawkins, and Christopher Hitchens. But I started criticizing political Islam because, I'm an ex-Muslim. I grew up in that country, and I know the kind of damage that it causes, beginning with Muslims. And I started getting attacked by people from that community, people who were atheists. Were like, well, maybe you should also criticize Christianity as much as you're criticizing Islam. And then I started getting, attacked more and more and more and more. And I was called a racist and a bigot and all.
Of course. Of course you were. So that was happening too, but it would have eventually, by the way, that would have eventually been a precipitating event had it not been some feminist thing first or whatever. And so that's the deal, is like this stuff, it will always, it's like, it's so toxic and it's so demanding that everybody take one side or the other. You hear this in the literature all the time. There's no such thing as a non-racist. There are only racists and anti-racists. So you have to pick a side. Are you on the side of the anti-racist, or are you going to be on the side of the racist? And that's the game that they play. They put people in these weird positions. So you ended up in the racist position, which is kind of funny. So, we had this guy come to a talk one time, not to divert my point, or I probably forget it, but we had this talk, and it was intersectionality of religion. And this guy from India was there, a professor, I forgot, something hard, something very technical, right? So this guy knows what he's talking about, and he's coming in and he listens to our whole thing, and he stands up. He's like, I want to talk to you guys because I'm very excited. And, he's got the thickest possible accent. I mean, really dark skin, the whole thing. And he's like, they're accusing me of being a white supremacist. I don't know why. They're accusing me of being a white supremacist. And it's just like, to hear it, with the super thick accent and everything else, it's just like almost hilarious that this is happening. And it's because, he taught this thing or whatever that supposedly has some possibly racist application, but he's like, but it's standard theory. I don't understand. And now I'm a white supremacist and all these kids. And it's like, I'm not even white, and it's just like, okay. But the point I was making is the thing is toxic, and it forces you to take sides, and there will always eventually be a precipitating event. That once there's this, and these tests for these things are happening constantly. It's once you have a sufficiently large sympathetic community that thinks in these zero-sum, like very Manichean terms, that's when that's going to happen. And then sooner or later, an event will either be manufactured, if you really want to be cynical about it, or one will occur eventually anyway. Like somebody will ask somebody out in an elevator, and then boom, it's like you've got all this powder and somebody just set a spark to it and the whole thing blows up. And then things are going to always fall apart. So there will always be one. So with the New Atheist movement, seeing the way that ex-Muslims were getting treated and the way that Sam Harris was getting called, it's gross, it's racist, the very famous Ben Affleck incident on Bill Maher, it was only a matter of time, if feminism didn't blow it up, that it being allegedly racist to criticize Islam was going to be the thing. That was the other hot button issue there. It wasn't like, the typical American black-white racism thing. It was definitely the white versus, or even not even white, but like American or Western view versus Islam, which that's covered under post-colonial theory more than it is under the other ones, but utterly forbidden. So that would have been the same fate was happening sooner or later anyway, and that would have been the thing if it wasn't feminism or if it wasn't something else first. It just so happened that it was this idiotic feminist thing that just because somebody gave it the attention it needed to become a wildfire, it became a wildfire. Hey, but you can't ignore it either, because if you ignore it, that's how it's growing sympathies.
Yeah. Maybe the silver lining is that because how awful this tribe of irrational fundamentalists are, bringing everybody else together against them. Can that be considered as a silver lining, or there is no silver lining?
I don't know if there's a silver lining. I mean, it does help actually for people to see that this really is a fundamentalist religious type thing. I had actually somebody send me a direct message on Twitter earlier, who's also from Iran, and he was talking. He's like, "This is, it's killing me to watch." He was talking about something in medicine, to watch exactly the same kind of theocratic nonsense, brainwashing taking place, even not just in the West, but in sciences like medicine, and to watch people do the same kinds of contortions that they did to defend religion. He's like, I left Iran because I wanted to get away from this. And now he's like, I never in my life thought that not only would I see it in the West, but that I see it in medicine, in a science. And then at the same time, I get messages constantly from people who escaped some place, whether it's, they or their parents escaped China during Mao, or whether it's, somebody their family escaped Cuba, whether it's somebody who escaped Hungary or lived through Hungary when it was communist, or people who have, were in the Soviet Union or who are in East Germany, or any of these kinds of stories. I get stuff all the time from these people who are like, what's happening? What we got out of, they say, communism, and communism is happening again. And here, where we came for safety, and it's just like really a shocking phenomenon to hear it so regularly compared to both communism and theocracy by people who lived in regimes. It's just a shocking thing. And the fact that people seem just so, asleep to the problem. I don't mean to, I hate that whole wake up thing. Wake up, sheeple, I hate that.
Yeah, me too. I don't even know what that means. Wake up to what? To do what?
Yeah, it's become aware is what it really means, right. But it's like, and become an activist, of course. So I don't want that to be the case, but it's like people really do have to understand that this isn't, this benign thing that's fighting for like human rights or human betterment. It's really something different. And when the people who have escaped theocracies, repressive, theocracies, and people who have escaped literal communist regimes that were brutal and awful are saying, stop, what are you doing? You're making the same mistakes. At some point you've really got to open your eyes and think, wait a minute, maybe this isn't just some like silly college kids yelling. Maybe something really bad is happening. Not to get too dramatic about it, but the Red Guard in China, which was one of the ways that Mao seized most of his power in his second big bid, was after the Great Leap Forward failed. The Red Guard was a bunch of college kids yelling and whining. That's what they were. And so it's like, open your eyes, this is actually serious. This is threatening stuff.
Yeah, I wish we had more time. We could talk a little more about China, but I know your time is limited. I want to talk about mathematics. You have PhD in mathematics. Do you think mathematics was invented or discovered?
Both. I have a very not common view about the ontology of mathematics. My philosophy of mathematics is, I don't know if it's unique, but I've not read much of it. So I fundamentally think that mathematics is empirical. It all starts with numbers, and our numbers start by counting things and seeing what happens when we count things. So it's, what we call a single unit, one, is definable once we define a unit of what. And so we have this idea of one that is one of any particular unit that you might choose. And then you can see what happens if you take one and then you take a second one and you put them together. In other words, you can add and you see that you end up with what we define to be 2 units and then 3 units and so on. And you could do experiments, although they would be very boring, about what happens if you multiply. So what happens if I take, say, 5 units of this and put it this way and 6 units of that and put it that way and make a grid? I'm always going to end up with 30 total units. And some multiplication comes out. So the very fundamentals of number theory are, in my opinion, likely to be empirical. And then they were axiomatized. They became a logical system. And then that logical system, because the axioms are so easily agreed upon when you're talking about relatively simple ones, like there is a number 0 or 1, whichever one you want, and then if you add 1 to it, there's this idea of a successor. Then you can start to predict what other axioms might be, and that's where you can start getting into the really abstract stuff, like being able to take 1 and add 1 again and add 1 again and add 1 again. In principle, indefinitely gives you this idea of what the infinite might be. It turns out you can't get to the infinite within, basic number theory axioms. So you have to add a new axiom called the Axiom of Infinity, but you can decide what that axiom is going to be in a pretty clear way. And then all of the rest of it just starts falling out. So in a sense, what you have is you have this discovery, which is to see how numbers work when you actually manipulate numbers of things. So that's discover. And this is going to go on 3 levels. The second level is that you start to formalize it as the language goes and make these abstract mathematical formalisms, which we later learned, thanks to Gödel, are known as axiomatic systems. And then the axiomatic system is something that we invent. And then once you've laid down the axiomatic system, you've now created within abstract space, but not real space, a very large number of true statements. In fact, an infinite number of true statements, but there are lots and lots and lots of true statements that are interesting. And you can then discover those truths within the abstract space. So it's like one step away from reality. Now, why are they so heavily coordinated with what we see in reality when we look back, out of abstract space into reality space? Well, it's because it was fundamentally empirical in the first place. We started with very easily agreed upon self-evident axioms, created a philosophy that we call a mathematics out of those axioms, and then discover truths within it as an abstract exercise. And then those reflect back very accurately on reality because it's a very tight-knit philosophy. It's a very, very tight-knit philosophy with mostly very basic, easily agreed upon so-called self-evident axioms that there's not a lot of wiggle room or argument to have about them. So I have a very different view of mathematics. Is it discovered or is it invented? It depends on technically what you mean by mathematics, but the axioms of mathematics are fundamentally, the basic ones are fundamentally discovered. Or sorry, they're empirical, they're discovered. Then there's an entire axiomatic formal system that's invented to service those axioms. So it's called, I just said axiomatic system. And there are truths to be discovered within that on I don't want to say different plane of existence, but it's within abstract space, not within reality space. So both.
I just find it
very. I don't think most people nobody thinks clearly about this stuff. I read so many things about this. It gets so frustrating. It's so, to me, muddle-headed. Even like really brilliant guys like Max Tegmark, totally a brilliant guy. I don't think I'm in his league, but I read his beliefs that reality is mathematics, and I'm just like, what the hell are you talking about?
How would you define reality?
I would say reality is what's out there. Reality is that which is, that's independent of any observer in any, meaningful sense.
And it's objective or subjective, the experience of reality that we are having.
the experience of reality is necessarily subjective.
Right.
Reality itself is objective. And we have a variety of methods that we refer to under the term objectivity that allow us to approximate. I don't want to say approximate. I want to say it allow us to make statements about objective reality, which we don't have any total access to. But those statements are so likely to be reflective of what really happens that we can place bets on them and win with not only high levels of confidence in some cases, but with measurable levels of confidence in almost all cases.
What's really interesting to me is based on this inherent subjective experience of reality that we are having. If you want to think about the concept of a higher power, higher being, or God, which to me is a placeholder. We're just using these terms without really understanding them. Love is another one. Consciousness is another one. Waking up people is another one. We just throw these things around. But would it be fair to say that a concept of a God or a higher being is inherently for humans unknowable because it is everything and anything that has any kind of an experience in the universal and beyond that scale?
I mean, yeah, if you want to use the word God to describe that which is beyond one's own capacity for comprehension, or that which is beyond even society's total capacity for comprehension, I'm okay with that. I have a friend who sometimes calls it God and sometimes uses the phrase infinity point, which it's interesting that he was calling it that because he didn't really know the math, but I actually talked about this a long time ago. When we have an infinite set, like the numbers 1, 2, 3, ... right? When you have an infinite set, we have this concept that it's infinite, but you can't actually know that it's infinite. Mm-hmm. And in fact, no matter how many numbers you list, we could 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, we could count for a long time. And then eventually you still have to put ... That ... is the infinity point. It's the point where if you look at numbers, we hit a point where we don't even have ways to name the numbers anymore. We don't know how to say them, right? There is no language for the numbers. You could technically, if you had time, write it down, but there's no language for it. Like we have million, billion, trillion, quadrillion, pentillion, and you can go on, but eventually you run out of terms. Then you actually get to the point where you physically couldn't write the numbers down. And still, it turns out all infinity of the numbers are still on the other side of that, right? And the ... So the infinity point, calling it the infinity point, where you just have to punt and say, well, there's infinitely more. My friend sometimes identifies that with God, right? I don't know that that's a great metaphor, but it does help. It's very much more Spinoza's God than it is like Christian God or Islamic God or even a Hindu God or any of these other kinds of deities. It's this idea that there's more out there than we can possibly grasp. And I really mean that when I say it with infinity point. We cannot possibly grasp or write down those numbers. We cannot possibly name them. And I mean that with absolute, like, not even sincerity, but that is absolutely true.
And that's because of our limits. That's because of our limits of comprehension and cognition, right?
No, it even goes beyond that. It's also beyond the limits. If you're talking about infinity, it's beyond the limits of physical reality. You take all of the possible quantum states possible in the observable universe, and there's only so many. And then infinite more numbers are bigger than that, right? And so there's only so many. So there's some point where you just have to put ... And all the magic is happening in those 3 dots. And so within a human, though, it is our comprehension, whether that's individually within our group of peers or our society or humanity as a whole. Different levels, of course, have different kind of ways of looking at knowledge. But there is this point where it's like, well, it's not that we don't know, it's that we actually can't know. And you can call that, kind of Spinoza's God. It's when I said, he said, how do you define reality? I said, it's what's out there. It's what's out there beyond, like this, you could call God what's out there beyond what we can know is out there. And fine, but I think it's a bad metaphor because so many different religions are comfortable using that to say, see, everybody believes in God. But then the thing that they mean by God, most people in the world, by
It's the
definition,
most
and all the
human
religions,
definition
don't.
of God.
Yeah, nobody believes in not nobody, I'm sorry. Most people don't believe in any given God.
Yeah.
You pick your favorite God in all of human history, most people haven't believed in it. Doesn't matter which one it is. Christianity or Islam, we're talking between them, we'll say it's the same God. You got something like 3 and change billion people believing in it. That leaves 4 and change billion people who don't right now. So it's not how that works. Most people don't believe in any given God.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So you have to be careful. My argument since like 2014 or so around that has been, look, if you want to call that God, fine, but you better be ready to acknowledge what you're saying God is, and you've got to be careful because it allows people who are being a little less scrupulous with their definitions to play a bait and switch game and say, see, you believe in God, you're an atheist and you believe in God. And what you mean is this like very abstract kind of what I can't know, that which is beyond me, that which is always bigger than me, that which is inherently beyond my control, and a belief that it works out or something is much of the time. All that stuff is not the same thing as, what you read about in the Old Testament.
No,
it's
absolutely,
just not the same
absolutely.
thing.
I mean, obviously, the gods of Old Testament and Quran and the human God has been, to me, created for the sake of power. Capitalize on it for power, the way that Christianity became the unity of church and state to get into politics. It has nothing to do with what, for example, mystics and Sufis, or, if you meditate or whatever it is that you want to do, or if you want to focus on philosophical aspect of artificial intelligence. That was one of the reasons that I asked, is it by nature unknowable, the infinity that you're talking about? Because some of the argument is that, well, maybe if we have a higher cognition ability in a form of whether artificial general intelligence or something beyond that, beyond the point of singularity, then that can be known. But you're saying that it's unknowable by nature.
There's always an unknowable. There's actually a short story, and I'm trying to think of who it's by. It's one of the very famous writers. I cannot think of who it's by, but somebody will be able to figure it out and tell us at some point. But it talks about, it's essentially that they built this AI machine and they ask it the same question over and over again, like what is the nature of reality or whatever, and it's trying to compute, and it says, insufficient data or whatever, and then the machine gets upgraded to an even more powerful machine, and it talks at each stage, like there's 5 or 6 stages, about how incredibly powerful it is now and how incredibly, like, the hard questions it can answer that are just unbelievably complicated. And then it's like, it keeps going stage after stage, and then it gets asked, what is the ultimate nature of reality or whatever, and it's like, more data needed, can't compute. And then it says that by the time that it finally, becomes like AGI becomes it has the ability to build itself and to marshal resources to its own calculational powers and everything. And so it takes it out basically to the heat death of the universe, and it has gathered all possible information to itself. And the question is posed, what's the ultimate nature of reality? And it's now got it literally is the only thing in the universe, right? It's become the entire universe. And it says, let there be light.
Oh, that's amazing.
And this is by one of the big writers. This is like Asimov or something like that, right? It's really worth reading. It takes like 20 minutes. I think it was Asimov that wrote it. But so even if you had this super intelligent artificial intelligence, the infinity point still exists. Infinity really is infinity. There's a funny saying that people who study mathematics learn, which is that all numbers are smaller than most. And so it doesn't matter how many numbers, whatever number you think is a big number, immediately I can say, well, think of a number 10 times that big, right? And your number is not that big of a number. Or I could say, think of a number 1 trillion times that big, and your number is now very small. And, of course, 1 trillion was also very small. So you can start thinking about how that stacks up and multiplies on itself to the point where it becomes very quick to understand that all numbers are, in fact, very small compared to most numbers, which all live in the ... to infinity. And that's a limitation of physical reality. So no artificial intelligence could surpass that. So there's always an unknowable. There's always an unknowable. And there's always a bigger than whatever. Even in the story, and like I said, I'm almost sure it's Asimov now, but I wouldn't bet anything on it.
We'll confirm.
Yeah, we'll confirm that. In that story, it literally takes all the way until it has every conceivable resource of the whole universe dedicated to its computational task, at which point it becomes God and starts the universe over.
Wow, that was amazing. That was awesome.
It's a pretty cool story.
Very. Yeah, very. I have to think even more about it. Let's wrap this up since you have stuff to do. What's next for you, and where can our audience follow your work?
Well, the follow is easy, so I'll say that first. You can find me on Twitter at Conceptual James, and I have a website that's newdiscourses.com, and it's kind of a repository for pretty much everything that I'm doing, and also it answers the other question, what's next for me? Most of what's next is there. I do have a book coming out on August, I think 25th, pandemic depending, called Cynical Theories, written with Helen Pluckrose, that traces the postmodern elements of social justice theory and explains how it is an evolution of postmodernism that we're dealing with in the woke movement today. But on New Discourses, I'm literally trying to lay out a comprehensive picture of as much of that movement as I possibly can, going into rather tremendous levels of depth. And I'm primarily spending my time writing what I've called social justice encyclopedia. So it focuses not on all the topics relevant to social justice, but just on their terminology. So I'm trying to explain the way that they use words and the way that their mindset is rooted in the way that they use words, and make it very, very clear when they say, such and such was a racist incident, or we need diversity, or whatever, or as we talked about earlier, non-consensual co-platforming. What in the world does this stuff really mean? So I'm trying to build that out. It's going to take me the better part of another year and a half to finish it, but there is a metric ton of useful information there now. People are reporting to me all the time. For example, they get in these, discussions or arguments or whatever they get into online, or they see these posts that people make and they're like, blah, 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 diversity initiative, yada, yada. And then they can go to my encyclopedia to where I've defined the term diversity, and they can just take it and post, well, that term means more than what most people understand it to mean. Here's a pretty comprehensive summary. And they post the link to the encyclopedia so people can understand it. My goal, by the way, with that is and always has been to make sure, look, maybe social justice, I don't think it's right. I think it's a catastrophe. But what I think doesn't matter, because I'm a person and I mess up. I think that people should be able to make a decision about social justice, but they should have to make the decision informed rather than uninformed. Or ideally, they should be making the decision in an informed capacity rather than in uninformed capacity. And my feeling is that the movement is selling itself as one thing when it's actually something very different. And if people understood it better, they could make a better decision about what they would want to do with it. I think most people, overwhelmingly most people, north of 90% of people would agree with me that implementing social justice as the movement is pushing it is a bad idea. Social justice as a concept is a different thing, and you can read about that on the encyclopedia too. So I think most people would reject it if they understood it. So I'm trying to help people understand it.
That's awesome. I hope I can have you back on the show when your book is out. We talk a little more about that. Let me ask you the last question I ask all my guests, that if you come across an intelligent alien from a different civilization, what would you say is the worst thing humanity has done? And what would you say is our greatest achievement?
Oh, that is a hard question. Those are really, really hard questions. So I would honestly say that our greatest achievement, that one's easier, was the recognition of fundamentally liberal principles. And I mean this in a very specific way. I see liberalism as a means of conflict management that tries to minimize subjective influence, because everybody has self-interest involved in their perspectives on conflict. So the attempt to make our conflict management, whether it's in knowledge, whether that's in law, whether it's in other arenas, as objective as possible, which isn't to say perfectly objective, has probably been humanity's greatest achievement. And it's no small thing to have arrived there. I don't know what humanity's greatest error would be, but if I had to try to talk in kind of blurry lines about it, it would be that we were unable to realize until we really messed it up that global conquest is not good. Like the idea that going to take over other territory and call it your own by force or by other kind of seditious methods is really not good. That is a huge thing that, I mean, I think of, to be honest with you, I think of World War II, and the story of this isn't actually over, but I think of World War II as the West's coming to terms with the fact that the colonial or imperial project is not compatible with advanced technology. And that's why I get really worried when I see nations right now, such as China, which are blatantly colonizing, because they haven't seemed to have learned the lesson. The big lesson there was definitely that colonizing the other territory is, especially by force, is not compatible with a society that develops advanced technology. It's if you're going around with horses and bows and arrows, maybe it's one story. But when you have tanks and aircraft and nuclear weapons, it's another story altogether. And so I would say that the greatest triumph then is the development of fundamentally liberal principles, and the greatest failure is the belief that which one can take for their own is their own. And of course, those two things are at odds.